Today's speaker is Daphna Levit, who just published a new book, Wrestling with Zionism, Jewish Voices of Dissent. The book is written by an Israeli about the long tradition of dissent against Zionism by Jewish and Israeli thinkers. While protests to the strident nationalist policies of the State of Israel are increasingly heard, they are rarely presented as one broad evolution. This book actually draws on the historical diversity of dissent that commenced with the inception of Zionism in the 19th century. And in the book, Daphna presents 21 key thinkers on the question of Israel and Zionism. So let me introduce Daphna. Daphna Levit is a member of Independent Jewish Voices in the Halifax chapter. She was born in Israel, served in the army, and studied at Tel Aviv University. She received a scholarship to study comparative Japanese literature at Indiana University and conducted Ph.D. research in Japan on a U.S.-Japan Friendship Commission grant on literature written by survivors of the atomic bomb. She also has graduate degrees in finance, an MBA, and in East Asian Studies, an MA in economics from Cornell University, and worked as a financial analyst in Japan, London, and New York at Merrill Lynch as a senior analyst, Morgan Stanley as vice president and head of the Japan desk, and Barings, senior vice president, head of the Asia desk, and Israel investment strategy coordinator. She has contributed numerous articles in both Hebrew and English to various publications, such as Haaretz and the Other Israel, and co-authored an earlier book, Israeli Rejectionism, a hidden agenda in the Middle East peace process, which was published in 2011. She was active in Gush Shalom, B'Tselem, Windows, Physicians for Human Rights, Makhsom Watch, Ta'ayush, and other peace organizations. She currently lives and teaches courses at academic institutions in Nova Scotia. So I'm going to mute my audio and video so that you can see Daphna, and I give you Daphna Levit.
Thanks. Am I audible? Am I heard? Okay, so for veteran members of IJV and fellow activists, my book and this talk could be considered a primer. But there are quite a number of people that I think might be attending today who have no or little background and might not even be Jewish. So bear with me as I try to introduce the complex subject to those who are not yet converted. Those people who believe, say, that Canada's supportive stance on Israel is the right one, without really being able to form an informed opinion on that subject. So this is more like preaching to the not yet converted so that we can get wider support for what it is that we think is morally right. Wrestling with Zionism, the book that just got published, Jewish Voices of Dissent, was published by Interlink Books in 2020 in the midst of the global pandemic, the crucially important and ongoing Black Lives Matter protests, and the outrageous announcement by the Prime Minister of Israel of annexation plans. So the first half of this year has been tumultuous, to say the least, and certainly not the most opportune time for the launch of a book about a long tradition of dissent from Zionism. And yet, maybe the past several years, the increasingly thunderous eruption of racist ideologies in parts of this world that were hitherto considered egalitarian democracies has possibly led to a greater awareness of the need for resistance and questioning. My own conversion from Zionism began during the 1967 Six-Day War But my active resistance was commenced in the early 1970s when the president of the World Jewish Congress at the time, Nahum Goldman, was invited to Egypt by President Nasser. This caused an uproar in Israel because Golda Meir and her government refused to allow him to go. So my fellow students at Tel Aviv University and I protested. We protested on her lawn and were sprayed with blue dye by the police. They were nicer, they didn't do tear gas yet, but the blue dye identified us so we could all be taken into custody. I left Israel for graduate school in 1972 when Golda was prime minister, and it was that Golda Meir who said, "It's not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine and we came and threw them out. They did not exist." This was based on an earlier quote from Lord Shaftesbury from 1853, where he famously said that Palestine is a land with no people for a people without a land. And this was the narrative that I grew up and believed until I couldn't believe it anymore. How could I reconcile the narrative of eternal victim of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust with the reality of occupation, the obvious mistreatment of Arabs in Israel, the uprooting of olive trees, the deprivation of water, and the total lack of freedom that was expressed in the various checkpoints that prevented Arab citizens of Israel to travel freely. So growing up in Israel, I considered my country a modern geographic political construct. There were religious Jews in Israel, but it was predominantly secular for the people that I was surrounded with. I, in fact, always rejected being considered a Jew because I was an Israeli, and an Israeli is a new construct that began with the secular ideology of Zionism. Recently, I was described as a Canadian Jew since I came here in 2002, and it's very strange for me to accept that classification, although possibly it's true. I still have a problem with it because the current Israeli identity as determined by the narrative is increasingly Jewish. Instead of an independent, sovereign, democratic country, the narrative has increasingly turned to include things like biblical homeland, a Jewish state, and so now being an Israeli means being Jewish, so Israel is a religion. I think that's what it means. In a democracy, however, if Israel is a democracy, all citizens should have, to some degree, equal rights, but the non-Jewish citizens of Israel don't. And Jews not even living in Israel, the Jews of Canada and the Jews of the United States, have preferential rights. So what about Jews who are not Jewish, like me? I mean, I am a-religious. In a bill in 2014, Benjamin Netanyahu declared Israel to be a Jewish state, or the nation state of the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. So this totally removes the pretext of a democracy. Requiring Palestinians to recognize Israel as such basically means that we have totally relinquished any attempt to be a democracy. Why should anybody, Palestinians or anyone else, consider a state a religion? So this is written about by several of the thinkers in my book, Chomsky for one, Uri Avnery, and several others. Shlomo Zand is one of the writers I write about in this book, and he famously wrote a book on how I stopped being a Jew, in which he discusses this at length. I'm going to go through a few slides that I created for this talk, if I can do technology well, and I'm not very good at it, but anyway, here we go. In 1922, Balfour, I think it's all his fault, said that Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is a far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. This was in 1922. So let's look at the demographics in 1922. As you can see, the green is the Arabs, the blue is the Jews, and until maybe 1950, the country was at least half Arab citizens. And in 2005, we can see that resumption because the birth rate among the Jewish people is lower than that among the Arab Israelis. I'd like to do another slide on the demographics. As of January 2020, so this is fairly recent, there are approximately 9 million, a little over, inhabitants in the state of Israel, of which the Jews compose 74%, the Arabs 21%, and by Arabs it means any religion other than Jewish. So that's about 2 million people. And then there are the others, which are persons who are deemed non-Jewish by religious law. In Israel, all civil law is organized and dictated by the rabbinate. So if you are not Jewish, you are effectively a second-class citizen. This development of dissent to an increasingly nationalist and possibly exploitation of the idea of a Jewish state starts very early with Echad Ha'am, who was one of the people who protested the emergence of political Zionism and wished to have Israel become a culturally Zionist country. And yet in 1891, contradictory to Lord Shaftesbury, he said, oh my gosh, Palestine is not empty. He even was annoyed at the fact that the Jews at the time, this is 1922, so there were fewer Jews than Arabs living in Israel, and yet there was a revenge killing of an Arab boy by Jews. And he says, is this the dream of the return to Zion, which our people dreamt for thousands of years, that we should come to Zion and pollute its soil with the spilling of innocent blood? Echad Ha'am is one of the best writers of Hebrew. He wrote Hebrew, which was not yet really a living language, beautifully. And when I was in high school, we still read Echad Ha'am. I don't think he's being taught today in high schools because he basically refutes the narrative that the country would like to portray, maintain. Among the other scholars that I talk about is Martin Buber. Some of you may have read him and his existential psychology, philosophy, but he was also a cultural Zionist, and he said some important things. He says, if Israel only wants to have a land that will be a land like other lands, this land will sink beneath its feet. He also said that the only way forward is for the Zionist movement to reach a consensus with the Arabs, even if it means that the Jews remain a minority in the country. And he said that the worst kind of assimilation in the course of Jewish history is nationalist assimilation. He says that which we lose on account of it, we shall perhaps never acquire again. If you could read Echad Ha'am, I highly recommend him. Most of you would probably be familiar with Albert Einstein, who was one of the people that Israel claimed as their own and incorporated into the Zionist narrative, but he never actually agreed with it. In fact, he said, I should much rather see reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace than the creation of a Jewish state. This today would be considered heresy. He also said famously, nationalism is an infantile sickness. It is the measles of the human race. I wonder if someone could quote that today in America. One of the scholars that I write about in this book and with whom I have been spending personally many years studying is Hannah Arendt, who had quite a bit of problems with the Zionist and the Zionist movement. And one of the things she warned about, which I think is coming true, is that an explicitly Jewish state would inevitably treat its Arab population as second-class citizens. It will be an endless provocation to hundreds of millions of Arab neighbors. It would channel its material and human resources into military preparedness, which she doubted could succeed indefinitely. She also said, a home that my neighbor does not recognize and respect is not a home. The sequence here of thinkers that I am presenting in these slides is not obviously comprehensive. I talk about 21 thinkers and scholars, and I show the development of their objections to the current narrative of Israel, but I wanted to give you a historical context, so that's why I started early. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Yeshayahu Leibowitz, but Yeshayahu Leibowitz was considered for many years one of the most important and influential Israeli thinkers, and very popular. You can still see some of his lectures on YouTube, except the problem would be that they are all in Hebrew. He was an Orthodox Jew, and he was very much opposed to the exploitation of religion. Remember this idea of Israel being a Jewish state, for secular political purposes, because he says that patriotism is a secular motive not imbued with sanctity, that the emergence of the state of Israel is not linked to the concept of messianic redemption, and that there is no justification for enveloping this political historical event in an aura of holiness, which is exactly what Israel has been doing. In fact, Leibowitz wrote, Israel ceased to be the state of the Jewish people and became an apparatus of coercive rule of Jews over another people, a Jewish regime of force. There are some phrases that Leibowitz used in his writings and in his speech, which are difficult to say because he talked about the Judeo-fascists. I think you have to read the book to see in what context he used that expression. Let's see. A person that we lost this year very recently was a man called Zev Sternhell, who is discussed at length in my book. And Sternhell was a secular historian. He was an expert on fascism. He wrote a lot about fascism and the rise of fascism. And he was a survivor himself of the Holocaust. For many years, he considered himself a super Zionist. And he said that the right of the Jews to control their fate and their future is a right of which the Jews were deprived by history, and Zionism restored it to them. So you would think that this is not a man that should appear in my book. But he also agreed that the argument of the Jews' historical right to the land was merely a matter of politics and propaganda for the secular founders of the country, and that any attempt to retain the conquests of the 1967 war, the war in which I became conscious that there were some contradictions, he said this had a strong flavor of imperial expansion. Sternhell also said that the Six-Day War, in which we can discuss later, but a lot of you know that the Six-Day War was a very victorious war for Israel, rendered obsolete the argument of the danger of Israel's disappearance. That argument that people now use, the security of Israel, which must be defended at all costs. He says, even the argument based on security was not free from a desire to exploit the occasion and extend the country's borders. He says, the only uncertain factor today is the moral and political price Israeli society will have to pay to overcome the resistance that the hard core of the settlers is bound to show to any just and reasonable solution. Now, for credibility's sake, I thought I should show you that Uri Avnery, who is pictured here, the man with the beard, was a friend of mine, because that's me and the blonde hair. This picture was taken in 2002, so I thought I'd show off. Anyway, Uri Avnery, in the introduction to his book, which is called 1948, he has a lot to say about Ben Gurion. And those of you who know the history of Israel know that Ben Gurion was one of the executors of political Zionism for many, many years. And he wrote, because Uri Avnery's writing style was quite fabulous, especially in Hebrew, but he translates well. He says, Ben Gurion effectively laid down the rails on which the state of Israel has run to this day. From the direction the train was pointing, I could see a collision approaching and tried to indicate an alternative, Israel as a secular republic, democratic and liberal, an ally of the Arab national movement, and a partner in the construction of a regional federation. Sadly, Uri Avnery, in his long-term feud with Ben Gurion, died in 2018. Now, there are a lot of problems with Ben Gurion, whose tradition, whose leadership inspired many of the concerns that I raise in my book about the nationalist, militarist evolution of Israel. At one point during the rise of Hitler, Ben Gurion was quoted, and this is quoted by Uri Avnery as a quote from Ben Gurion, that Zionism bears the obligation of a state. It therefore cannot initiate an irresponsible battle against Hitler because he remains a head of state. Today, if we look back at this quote, it is a bit shocking. There is another quote here where we find among some of the writers that I raise, that I discuss in this book, several that are very opposed to the exploitation of the Holocaust that has permitted Israel to commit crimes that shouldn't be permitted, that Israel, despite being the supreme victim, as it likes to portray itself, shouldn't have done some and shouldn't do some of the things that it does. Ilan Pape, who I do discuss at length in my book, quotes Ben Gurion as saying, "If I knew that it was possible to save all the children in Germany by transporting them to England, but only half by transporting them to Palestine, I would choose the second, because we face the reckoning of those children, but the historical reckoning of the Jewish people. So the state of Israel takes precedence over the lives of half of the children of Germany who perished in the Holocaust." This is a bit shocking. Another one of the lesser known voices of dissent was also a friend of mine, Tanya Reinhardt. She says in her many writings that Israel's founders, and this includes Ben Gurion, believed that ethnic cleansing was the only way to save Jews from extinction. So do most Israelis. But even since 2000, she says, forgive me, there was an obvious and systematic effort to break Palestinian society and destroy its infrastructures, resulting in intended total dependence on the military occupier who controlled every aspect of their lives and economy. Massive internal propaganda in Israel deludes Israelis to this day into thinking that this is justifiable self-defense. Now, at a certain point in Israel's history, the government released documents that meant that now suddenly we have a group of historians writing history that's based on actual records that were released, rather than on the propaganda and the narrative that the Zionists wanted us to believe. Some of these are in my book, some of them I didn't have enough room and I had to stop somewhere. But the narrative that they created was based on government papers that were newly declassified in the 1980s, 30 years after the founding of Israel. One of them is Tom Segev, who says that I shouldn't be a new historian, but rather I should be a first historian. I'd like to discuss the last bit of information in my slide, which is the demographics of the Palestinians affected by Israel. So these are the latest that I could compile. There may be some of you who have better information, but there are about 12.5 million Palestinians, of whom close to 2 million live in Gaza, a prison enforced by Israel, almost 3 million in the West Bank. In Israel proper, about 2 million, which represents 20.9% of the population, etc. But there are estimates, and these are on various studies, that by the end of the 2020s, the Palestinians will outnumber the Jews in Israel. This is what terrifies the leaders of Israel and requires either annexation or further ethnic cleansing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now because that's the end of this. And now I'm back to you. What I wanted to say and what I say in my book is that one of the lawyers who I discuss in my book, Michael Sfard, who is a human rights lawyer, he says he has the thankless task of trying to protect human rights under occupation. And he says that regimes that are fundamentally subjecting people, stripping them of rights, especially groups of people, are regimes that by definition are not sustainable. They must keep nurturing themselves and investing in the domination practices to keep things from exploding. So we know that what we see today closer to us in Canada, in the continent, in this continent, is very similar to what we've seen for many decades in Israel. But Israel is a tiny, tiny speck of a consistent regime that has exploited a narrative. And this is the narrative that I want to, what is it? De-revisionize? Rewrite? Anyway, thank you. I'm sorry if I've stumbled. This is very exciting.
Okay, Larry Haven here. Sorry, Daphna, I was just sending a timing message as a text. I didn't realize that it made so much noise, but that was me. Okay, before we go to the audience, I just want to, I don't know if you see this because I've got a virtual background, but this is Daphna's book. And Daphna, yeah, good. Daphna, tell us how we can obtain this book. What are the best ways?
So if you are in the States, the best way is to go to Interlink Books, which is my publisher, who, by the way, the publisher himself is a Palestinian. And his publishing house, Interlink Books, is phenomenal. If you are in Canada and shipping costs from the States are too exorbitant, Indigo Books and Amazon.ca also have it. I don't know if the libraries have it yet because obviously it came out during the pandemic and most of the libraries were closed. So that's what I know.
And I'm just going to explain to people how you can ask questions. But before I do, I just want to add something that might have confused people. You were mentioning, for example, right near the end, that the Palestinians at some point might be a majority in Israel. I think we need to distinguish between Israel, the state of Israel, and Israel plus the occupied territories.
Yeah.
And Daphna was referring to Israel plus the occupied territories.
Yeah. So if you look at the demographic chart that I posed earlier, you can see that we have, as I said, about 2 million in Gaza, about 3 million in the West Bank, and then about 2 million proper in Israel. That still numbers less than the Jewish population, but eventually the expectation is that this could obviously be inverted, reversed, and therefore Israeli policymakers are terrified.
Okay, I'm going to explain to people how you ask a question. There's two methods to ask a question. So by automatically, all of the audience is muted to start with. However, the first way to ask a question is you click on the icon. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, participants will pop up. You'll see participants. And it's at the bottom center of your PC or Mac screen. At the bottom of the window on the right side of that screen, click the button labeled Raise Hand. You'll see that. And I've already got a message to participants, raised hand. So when you do that, your digital hand is raised. and I will see the hands, and I'll try to recognize you in order, but it doesn't always let me do that. So, and when I recognize you, I will unmute you, and you can ask your question. And then I will mute you again when you're finished and go on to the next person. The second way to ask a question is, again, you go to the, at the bottom of your dialog box for Zoom, you will see an icon entitled Q&A. You can leave a question in text there, and we'll try, like if you have to leave early or if you're shy or whatever, and I'll try to read these questions out loud. And if necessary, if we don't have time, we'll answer it in text. The other thing is, if we have a very large audience, we have, last I looked, about 125 people. And if there are too many questions, we may have to take a bunch of them together before we let Daphna answer. So let me just go to and find out. Okay, so the first person that I have raising their hands is Judith Goldschmidt. And Judith, I'm going to allow you to talk right now.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how that happened.
That's okay. Next person is Linda Cohen. Sometimes it takes a few minutes to, a few seconds to get your voice, but I think your microphone is open, Linda.
Okay, that's great. I could not be more grateful to hear Daphna's presentation. And I was wondering, when she showed the slide of the comments by Martin Buber, what did he mean by nationalist assimilation? Everything else seemed very clear to me in the presentation, but I wasn't, Buber's comments were a little mystifying. I just don't understand. If she could explain it, that'd be great.
So can I speak? Am I heard? Am I muted?
No, no.
Oh, okay. So Martin Buber was, as you know, he revived pretty much the whole tradition of Hasidism. He was very much into the cultural aspect, as you know. His writing had to do with a discussion between God and the soul, that the Judaism and belief comes from a dialogue, a constant dialogue with God. But he was writing at a time when assimilation was sort of what Jews in Europe were discussing as a way to defeat anti-Semitism. And he didn't believe that assimilation was an answer, which even Herzl, who originally believed that assimilation would be the solution, even he changed his mind and said, no, we can never assimilate. Martin Buber had a different approach, and he believed that assimilation to others would basically mean that we have no right, that we're not entitled to the land of Israel. Because what we're saying is that if we want an Israel, it has to be cultural Judaism. It has to be because we have something special that is not like everything else, like everybody else. And what he was seeing was an emergence of a tendency towards nationalism in the Jewish consciousness, the idea that we will be a country with an army and we will fight and we will do all these things. And that was not his solution. So he was terrified of this evolution of a nationalist assimilation, to be like other nations and be, you know, patriots. Very much like, very similar, although different, to Leibowitz's point of view.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know if that helps, but I can refer you, if you'd like to contact me, to some of his writings on the subject.
Okay, now we have quite a few written questions too, and I'm going to go through maybe 2 or 3 of them together. My apologies to the people who asked them, but in order to get more questions, more of you folks and less of Daphna, who's had a chance to speak, I'm going to bunch some of these questions and then let Daphna answer them, and that way we can fit more people in. So Johanna Fisher says, how was your work, I think she means, received in Israel, especially in light of Netanyahu's recent policies in regards to Palestine and the pandemic that seems to have cleaved a further divide between Israel and Palestine? That's the first question. So how was it received? How was your work received in Israel? Jeffrey Wilkinson says, can you talk about how the thinkers you studied deal with the conflation of self-determination and sovereignty, and how this has accelerated since the Holocaust? So I'll give you a chance to answer those, Daphna, and then we'll go back to a live audio questioner.
So thanks, Johanna. Hi. The book has not yet been released in Israel. I mean, it's barely been released here. It was released a few months ago in English. I know that friends of mine in Israel were trying to buy it and they couldn't get hold of it because Amazon in Israel wasn't delivering it. So I have no way. I don't even know how it's received here because it's just been 2 months. If there is an interest, I might translate it myself into Hebrew and then might have a response for you. And the second question was what self-determination and sovereignty. I'm not sure I understand the question. The idea that Israel wanted to have its own state. Are we talking about the beginning of the Zionist movement? Is that what the question is about? And the idea of being a sovereign state as opposed to,
well, because this is a written question, I'm going to guess that the author of the question wants you to talk about the claim of supporters of Israel that Zionism is merely the struggle, the seeking of self-determination for the Jewish people.
So that's what I try to cover in the book, to say that whilst my father was born in Germany and his family was destroyed in Germany. So I certainly, like Zev Sternhell, feel that, if it weren't for Zionism, I would never have been born. And, but on the other hand, I find that Israel has moved away from a legitimate argument that the Jews should have a state, which, by the way, when it was originally proposed, could have been in Uganda or even in Australia. So it wasn't so much the whole idea of this is our legitimate homeland. So I can't refute, and I don't in the book, discuss whether Israel is legitimate or not. What isn't legitimate as a sovereign state is that it's unequal, it's an occupation of another country. It's an occupation of people, and it's mistreatment of second-class citizens. And so I don't know if that answers your question. Read the book, it's in the book, I hope.
That's the beautiful thing about talking about a book. You can always say it's in the book, which it is.
It is.
I'm going to turn now to 2 live questioners. First, Tony Greenstein, and then Bruce Gunn. So, Tony, I'm just unmuting you.
I'm afraid of Tony.
Uh-oh.
Okay, thank you, Daph. I don't know whether you can see me or not. No, I don't think you've got video on, have you?
No, I know what you look like from your pictures.
That's bad enough. Okay, I get the meaning. One question, because you sent me the PDF. Incidentally, I would still like a copy of the book just for memory's sake. But one question that ran through my head when I was reading your book was, does Daphna accept the settler colonial paradigm, the analysis that Zionism from the very start, from its very beginnings, was a settler colonial enterprise? Or do you think it somehow lost its way along the journey? I think that's important, because I certainly adhere to the first. I think in terms of the major Zionist institutions, in particular the Jewish National Fund, from the very start, they aimed to buy up or obtain the land of the Palestinians and then ensure that they never ever returned to that land. At that time, as laborers, they bought up land for the kibbutzim or and the collective settlements. And from there onwards, the Palestinians were alienated from that land. And if you wanted to read about that more, the best description is the Hope Simpson inquiry. I mean, obviously, I've got a number of questions, but two come to mind in particular. Firstly, Martin Buber, and also Ehad Ha'am. I think, in my opinion, you emphasize the effect and the impact of cultural Zionism too much. Cultural Zionism, to me, was an interesting phenomena, but remarkably, it's had absolutely no effect on the outcome of Zionism today. The effect of Buber, Judah Magnus, and all the others is zero. Incidentally, Buber came from German Zionism. He was a blood and soil Zionist, I have to say. German Zionism was the most reactionary of all. And I think that did affect some of his things. But the third question, you mentioned and quoted from David Ben-Gurion and his appalling quote on saving German Jewish children. And a number of Zionists have tried to exonerate him by saying, well, when he made that statement, he didn't actually believe that they would therefore perish. I don't think that's tenable. But I wondered if you wanted to say anything about the attitude of Zionism towards saving anybody, because throughout the war, I mean, from the beginning, in fact, not in the beginning, but from 1933 onwards, Zionism's attitude to Hitler was a number of things. Firstly, a number of leading Zionists, Ben-Gurion, Katznelson, who was his deputy, and others, welcomed the rise of the Nazis as being a golden opportunity for Zionism. I'm not saying they welcomed the idea that the Jews would suffer from the Holocaust. They didn't, because they didn't foresee the Holocaust. But they saw the rise of the Nazis, and actually Joachim Prinz, who was a leader of German Zionism, said German dissimilation, as he put it, which was the Nuremberg laws, was our dream. The idea that Jews would no longer be part of the host nations was the dream of Zionism. Of course, it didn't turn out like that, and it became anything but a dream. But the attitude of Zionism towards the Jews of Europe was one which said, we will take those of you who we think can benefit our enterprise, but we're not particularly concerned about rescue. And indeed, the attitude during the war to rescue was, if it wasn't to Palestine, they weren't interested. In fact, there are a number of examples where the Zionist movement opposed rescue schemes which were to other countries. San Domingo is the most famous. It was the only place during the Evian conference in 1938. I won't go into Evian.
Hello, Tony.
Oh, sorry.
Hi. Tony, we've got so many people waiting to ask questions.
My apologies, yes.
And
my apologies.
I have to cut you off. Daphna, I'm going to take one more live question, and then I'll turn it back to you. So the next live questioner is Bruce Gunn. Bruce, go ahead. Bruce, are you there?
Okay, am I on now?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. I appreciate being in this webinar. I'm not Jewish, but I came to the issue of the creation of the state of Palestine through the book of Alfred Lilienthal back in 1967. So it's about 50 years since I read that book. but all of the things that have happened. Sorry.
Did you get to finish your question?
I'm aware of happening in the state of Israel from that time on are pretty much in line with the fears that he expressed in that book, as I recall it. My question I have for Daphne is, is she aware of that book, and where does it sit in her mind in terms of a precursor to what is happening today in the state of Israel?
Okay, thank you, Bruce. And then I'm turning it back to Daphna.
So I got a little lost with Tony's questions. I don't know what to do about them because it would require a 2-hour lecture. In the book that I wrote, I did quote Bismarck, who said that the only way to expand is to take control of another country, and that this was sort of the philosophy of the early Zionists. So yes, I did see it as a colonial enterprise, and I write a lot about that a lot of the early Zionists had no clue where they were going. They knew nothing about the land. That maybe Herzl knew a little bit, but it was shocking to Echad Ha'am when he came to Israel and said, oh my gosh, this land is not empty. There are people living there. That didn't change the political Zionists' agenda. So yes, there's a lot that I could write, but it would have to be the next book. What I did with this book was try to introduce some of the thinkers that I think are crucial to show the evolution of dissent. That dissent is not yet over. There's a lot to discuss about it. As for Bruce's question, I'm not familiar with that book, so I can't actually answer. Most of my reading has been done in Hebrew, from writers who write in Hebrew. So I can't really help. I can't respond to that question, sorry.
Okay, we're going to turn to 2 written questions now, and I'll give to give more people a chance to ask questions. The first one is from Felix Almeida. The Jewish narrative of Israel appears to be synonymous with the Ashkenazi narrative. How do the Sephardim, the Mizrahim, all non-Ashkenazi Jews feel about this dominance? So it's a question about non-Ashkenazi Jews. The second question is from David Kattenberg. Daphna, thanks. With our new UN ambassador, meaning for those of you who aren't Canadian, the new Canadian ambassador to the United Nations is Bob Ray. With his comments on Gaza a few hours ago in mind, he only finds fault in the quote unquote terrorist group Hamas. How do we get ostensibly reasonable and smart people to rethink Zionism and their unconditional support for it? For Zionist settler colonial apartheid Israel. So you've got 2 questions there.
I like the first question very much. There is a section in my book in which I discuss a thinker by the name of Tikva Honig Parnas, who was a member of Matzpen, which is a very, it's sort of a communist group. And her interests are in the non-Ashkenazi narrative of Israel. We had a very difficult time in Israel because every one of the original Zionists, the political Zionists in particular, were Ashkenazi. They all came from Europe. It was part of the movement that was started in Europe. The treatment of the non-Ashkenazi Jews is a story in prejudice. It's a story in discrimination. It's a story that, very similar to the Black Lives Matter, has been kicked under the rug in Israel. It's not discussed, but there's a lot to say about that. And yes, most of the people that I write about are from the Ashkenazi tradition. And if I could, if I live long enough, I might try to do better for other books. But this is not the narrative that they came up with, because they were the second-class citizens to the first-class Ashkenazi Jews, and the Arabs and the Palestinians were even below that. So this is a caste system. I'm sorry if I'm being very harsh. I can't remember. What was the second question? I wrote it down and then I...
I'm trying to find it.
Oh, it was David Kattenberg's question about Bob Ray. Yeah, I think that the problem with there is so much information in the world now, and there's so much upheaval in the world that people don't have time to actually understand what they're talking about. So I don't know how much Bob Ray actually knows about the situation in Israel, but it's obviously popular to lump all the Jews into one homogeneous plate and say this is the Jewish vote. Hopefully, with more people aware that there is a dissent, that there are people with different views, and they are Jews, that maybe we will get somewhat more of an informed political representation. I don't know if I'll live long enough, but I hope some of you will.
Okay, we're going to go back to live questioners, and the next person I have, and I think Zoom is allowing me to take these in order, at least I hope it is, but the next one we have is Ralph Seliger. Ralph, you're unmuted.
Okay. All right, hello. It occurred to me that most of the people that you mentioned in your book, who you write about, did consider themselves Zionists of some sort or another, and I think that a lot of them actually would not have considered themselves simply cultural Zionists. For example, I know someone who worked with Martin Buber, and I said, did he consider himself Zionist? He said he certainly did. And this friend of mine was a member of Hashomer Tzir, believed in a binational state, is very active in the Israeli peace movement to this day. And I think you're giving short shrift to dissenting voices within the Zionist movement, both historically and today.
I think that your question is very important, but when I talk about the period before, say, 1967, which I think is a crucial moment, the concept of cultural versus political Zionism came into existence later. It wasn't that someone like Echad Ha'am thought of himself in one way or another. I think that as far as Echad Ha'am was concerned, he had a disagreement, a long-standing disagreement with Herzl, and he wanted a different type of Israel. He wanted a state. He wanted a Jewish state, whereas Herzl wanted a state for the Jews. He very clearly writes that. I think that I am attributing cultural Zionism to someone like Buber and to even someone like Leibowitz, even though I don't think that they would accept that. I know that Avnery was a Zionist. I know that Yeshayahu Leibowitz was a Zionist originally, and he was one of the few people who wanted to turn the rabbis in Israel into Zionists. So yes, the term is fuzzy, and I'm glad you pointed that out. It's not that there is a, cultural Zionism versus a political Zionist debate. That was sort of the evolution, that there were aspects of dissent to Zionism before the 67 war, and they were not clearly defined as one or the other. So you're right. I mean, Shomer Tza'ir and Beitar and all of these movements were Zionist movements, and they all disagreed. I think that the non-Zionists would be the people in Matzpen, and then later after that, after the new historians, we have several anti-Zionists. I don't know if that helps.
I actually allowed you to answer that question before we took the second one, but that's okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm going to allow now, the next live questioner is Sid Schneid. So Sid, go ahead.
Hi, Sid.
Hi, Daphna. Delighted to see you. Looking forward to reading your book. If it's anything along the lines or the quality of your last one, the Rejectionism book. A quick question, but I think it cuts to the heart of it. Do you now consider yourself a Zionist or an anti-Zionist? Why or why not?
Okay, so on the spectrum definitions, I probably lean more towards anti-Zionist than anything else, although for a long time I considered myself a non-Zionist. So I'm not sure. I have a problem with classifications because they're sort of slippery. Sort of like I said before, Judy Haven described me as a Canadian Jew, which on the one hand I felt really good because I didn't realize I was Canadian. I mean, now I'm Canadian, so that makes me happy. Jew is a problem because I'm not really a Jew, am I? I don't know. So it's the same about Zionism. It's a very squishy kind of thing. I think I tend to be anti-Zionist. Does that
Okay,
help?
I'm going to go back to the written questions, and I'm going to try and ask two together, so hold on. This one's from Brendan Campbell. Before I ask that, we are almost at the hour. However, if there's no problem for you, Daphna, and I'm going to go for another, well, up to 10 minutes, because we still have some questions, but I'm going to end it around 10 after the hour. So here's a question from Brendan Campbell. Is there still a viable Brit Shalom movement today among liberal Zionists? Because it seems that Zionism is not going anywhere, and hoping for otherwise is not super realistic. So that's from Brendan Campbell. Question from Avram Rosner. Given the explanation about the demographic numbers, that they represent Israel plus the occupied territories, how can annexation alleviate that problem for Israel? So 2 questions.
You remind me of the first one. I'm kind of, my brain is spinning, so I'm not sure I caught it.
Yeah, is there still a viable Brit Shalom?
No, yeah, that's right. No, I don't think there is. And I don't think that, I saw in the chat that somebody asked, is there really any opposition in Israel to the Zionism, to the extreme nationalist Zionism of the current government? And I don't think that there is. I think it's very scary. The conclusion to my previous book, which Sid mentioned, was that we're pretty hopeless about what's going on. And if we keep seeing a constant, constant extreme right agenda of politicians in Israel, I don't see how the country can continue to exist. And eventually the forces, the demographic forces and the forces maybe, hopefully someday, of justice and morality would put an end to what we're seeing Israel turn into. As for, what was the second question? I'm losing it.
Yeah, given the demographic numbers about the balance between Jews and Palestinians in, let's call it, Greater Israel, how can annexation alleviate that problem? I sense a tone of irony here.
Exactly. I just heard a really interesting webinar with my publisher, Michelle Mushabach, who is a Palestinian, Interlink Books, and Phyllis Bennis. And the subject was annexation and how the whole problem of annexation is basically to continue policies that have been in effect in Israel really for decades, and that is to shrink the Palestinian population and to keep an ethnic majority of Jews. So I don't really see that annexation can achieve that. The question of demographics is crucial. Unless Israel somehow succeeds in making lives of the Palestinians so miserable that many of them will leave the territory, the area, the land, which would be a disaster, but that's just my.
Yep.
And as a financial analyst for many years, I had to use forecasting models for the future of companies and their profits, and I came to the conclusion that the only thing one should never forecast is the future.
Okay, two more questions. Peter Larson says, "Hey, Daphna." I think he means hi, but he's obviously in the generation of people younger than myself. Thanks so much. Clear and thoughtful. I do have a potentially difficult question. When you refer to the occupation of Palestine, what is the exact geographical area you are referring to? And the second question is, technical one, is the book available electronically? If not, will it be?
So you realize this is I'll answer the second one first because that's easy. The book is just really hot off the press. It just came out. And so the electronic version, I've been told, will appear eventually, but so far there is none. I'm not sure how it works. My previous book was not electronically available, but that was 2011, so that was pre-digital age, I suppose. Anyway, as for what I consider to be the occupation, it's not really my definition, it's the conventional definition of the occupation. And that would be, there are several maps that I wish I could screen share to show you what exactly I mean. So we could talk about in Israel proper, we could talk about the West Bank, we could talk about the Gaza Strip, we could talk about areas C, all of these areas within Israel proper where there are Palestinian or Arab Israelis who prefer to consider themselves, apparently according to a poll conducted, they prefer to be considered Palestinian rather than Arab Israelis or Israeli Arabs. Anyway, so wherever it is that Israel imposes rule and controls their lives, be it their water supply, being it their electricity, being everything that has to do with civil life, that is where the occupation is. And there are several maps that were put out by Gush Shalom on the Gush Shalom website, which you can see, that show you the extent of the occupation.
Okay, I'm going to ask two more questions that were text questions. And we're almost running out of time. So if there's anybody else who hasn't asked a question and wants to ask a live question, put your hand up, but I don't see anybody right now. So Judy Haven asks, 2 states or 1 state? What is your opinion? And Curtis Bell says, how do you think the nearly unconditional support for Israeli oppression of Palestinians by Jewish people in the US, Canada, and Israel can be changed to a human rights orientation?
So, Judy, obviously, I have never believed in the 2-state solution. I think Israel should be a state for all its citizens and with equal rights for all. I have always believed that. This is not a new development. Whether it's possible, I think that the 2-state solution is long, long, long gone. Don't think it's possible. As for how do we change the minds of people who don't understand, is more Larry Havens, more Judy Havens, more people who can write and talk about the truth and enlighten people to see that you know, blind support for Israel is not going to support Israel. It's not supporting the people. It's not creating peace. It's perpetuating a constant state of war. I wish I knew how to solve that. I wish I know how to teach people, but.
Okay, here's one from an anonymous attendee. Hasn't the Zionist movement always had different ideological streams? Isn't this why most of the people you name in your book, from Ahad Ha'am to Michael Svard, would or have considered themselves Zionist? So have a try at that.
Okay, so I think that everybody who was born in Israel and grew up in Israel was indoctrinated into a Zionist narrative. I don't think any of us escaped it. Tikva Honig Parnas had a long time ago had a talk on Democracy Now! And she talks about the brainwashing, the fact that we've we are all Zionists. We were all, just as I said, I was indoctrinated into believing that we deserved Israel and everybody else who was not Jewish should get out. And that if they don't get out, that they're all going to drown us in the sea because they're going to be so powerful. And so we have to develop a more powerful army. That is true of everybody in this book who was born in Israel or at least grew up in Israel. Those who preceded the state of Israel, yes, they had separate and dissenting views, but I don't think it's widely known. And that's why in this book, I tried to show that. I tried to show that dissent is not a recent phenomena, that it started, in fact, as you point out in the question, with the inception of Zionism, that there were people with disparate views that how should Israel be? So I think that's what you're pointing out, and that is exactly what I agree with.
Okay, we're coming to a close now, but I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to reach down a little further into the text questions because I know this is something you're particularly interested in, Daphna, and also I am too. Denis Kosem says, I would have a request. I would love to hear Daphna talk more. Not now, Daphna, because we're going to end this, but I would love to hear Daphna talk more about Hannah Arendt with respect to Zionism. Now, I know Daphna has spent a lot of time looking at Hannah Arendt, and one of the ideas that several of us have come up with is Independent Jewish Voices book club, an online book club, sort of like using Zoom or whatever. And one of the books I think we would like to study is Eichmann in Jerusalem. I don't know if that's a good book to start with, but it certainly is one of the most controversial. One of the reasons I like that book is because it's available, especially in these lockdown days. It's very hard to get to libraries, and it's inexpensive, and you can order it from Amazon. You can order it also on cheap or inexpensive or free services in libraries. Anyway, so, but I'll let Daphna just answer that very quickly about Hannah Arendt, and then we're going to have to close this out.
So I've been studying Hannah Arendt now for about 5-6 years. I have a weekly group that I discuss Hannah Arendt with. I attended courses in Halifax, every single Hannah Arendt course that I could attend. I have read, I think, everything she ever wrote several times over, and Eichmann in Jerusalem is a good book to start. First of all, it's small, whereas if we started with the origins of totalitarianism, we might never make it to the end. So yes, I think it's a brilliant book to start, especially with regard to her own personal problem with Zionism.
Okay, so we're at 12 after the hour, and I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. If I can just check, I think at our height we had about 125 people, which may be setting a record for our webinars in IJV. So I want to thank everybody who has attended and who has asked questions, either live or in text. But I especially want to thank Daphna Levit.
Thank
you now all have to go out and get her book. I just wanted to say that, you know, if you can arrange for an electronic copy, I know it shorts the author. You don't get as much royalties from it as you might if it's print, but that's the way we're heading. I myself like to read, you know, books, books, downloadable books, and so I would recommend that. But again, thank you, Daphna, so much. Everybody read the book. It is a fantastic, both advanced textbook and a primer at the same time. So what better can you say about it? Thank you all so much.
Thank you.